Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for stopping by. This is Weekend Watch Repair, and my name is Adam. If you're new to the channel, I appreciate you stopping by and taking a look. And for the regular viewers of this channel, you probably noticed that this video is significantly shorter than all the other ones that we really do on the channel. What's going to be different about this watch is we're not doing a mechanical service on it, which is generally what we always do, is do a complete dismantling of a watch, fix any faults we can find and rebuild it. What's this watch, and by the way, what we're working on here is a Seiko 6139 6009 notch resist from November of 1970, or excuse me, from March of 1970. This watch belongs to a viewer named Andy who reached out to me a while back and asked if I could take a look at this thing. So what we're going to be doing is this video is, my idea is to show you what a case servicing is and how I do it. And I'm not saying I do it better or worse than anybody else. This is just kind of how I do it. Again, I am an amateur on this. I am a hobbyist, but try to be real thorough in my work and do the best job I can. And a lot of the footage that you're going to see in this video is stuff that generally is edited out of the longer format videos. We go into a bit more detail on some of the more nuanced steps in the process. So we're going to refurbish this case top to bottom. As you can see here, as we're doing some testing, we have some pushers that are stuck. Generally, it's because those gaskets have hardened. It's actually not the case on this watch, although at the time when I was, checking the watch, I'd figured that the gaskets were shot. So this watch belongs to a gentleman named Andy, again, who is a subscriber to the channel. And Andy, thank you again for reaching out. He picked this watch last year and said, Adam, the timekeeping is, it's fair, but, the pushers are stuck. And I just want the case gone through thoroughly to make sure that everything's tip top. All the gaskets are good. Let's go ahead and put a new crystal in it, make sure everything's functional, and just make it a good wearable watch. But he didn't feel like he needed to invest the time, to get the full-blown service done right now. He said it's keeping time well enough. So, at this point here, I haven't even put the thing on a time grapher. We're just starting to disassemble it. And as you see me taking off the bracelet, we're going to go through and see what the condition of this watch is, what faults we find, with the case, why it is kind of the way it is, because there's some kind of unique stuff going on with this thing. So Andy picked this up, and it's a beautiful example of a rather uncommon notch resist model, but someone had definitely worked on it. I'm guessing, so they had cleaned it. And ironically, this is a case servicing video. You'd expect the case to be extremely dirty. And on this one, surprisingly, it's really not. But, Andy just wanted it gone through just to make sure it's, going to be a reliable wear. So the case, although not terribly dirty, we are going to go top to bottom in the full process of cleaning it like we would even the dirtiest case. And I'll show you that step by step. We get the case back off real quick. And I do not see any watchmaker marks inside that. There's one little scribble. I'm pretty sure that's not one, but someone has most certainly worked on this watch, although, and even recently, but no one marked it. We go ahead and pull the case back gasket off. There's a little bit of life left into that. It's a little bit stiff, but not completely shot. That gasket probably had another few years left in it at least, but it's going to get all fresh gaskets. And we want to go ahead and remove just the rotor. We're not going to disassemble this movement, but I don't want to, you don't want to let these watches sit and rest, especially for long periods of time on that rotor. It puts unnecessary sideways pressure on that bearing. So we're just going to go ahead and pull that oscillating weight off until we're done with this watch. The first thing we need to do is remove the movement ring. In order to do that, we're going to push in the two pushers, although one of them's already stuck inwards. And that will allow us, that will free them up from the movement ring, because that ring there is what retains those pushers. And generally speaking, at this point, we can go ahead and push those pushers out. But this first one here is stuck. And I mean, this pusher is stuck hard. And generally, it's because those gaskets that are in those have just become rock solid. Although, and you'll see when we pull this out, this one's more stubborn than 99% of them I've ever come across. So much so that I'm having to get a different angle and kind of push it in and destroy the tips of my brass tweezers. But we'll get one side of the tweezer in there, and that's just enough on these curved tweezers. I can get behind that, and there we go. See it push out a little bit. Even with it pushed back out, it still doesn't want to come out. So we'll give it a little bit more. There we go. Now we can go ahead and pull this thing out. And taking a look at that gasket, that is generally, see how it's totally flat? That's what those gaskets can look like when they get very worn out. And at first glance, that's what a worn out gasket's going to look like, is just completely flat. Here's the other one. And then I noticed something on the outside of that pusher. You see on the outside of that pusher, I wasn't sure what that was at first because this button here was a little sticky, but wasn't completely stuck. When we look at it further, that's actually somebody put silicone grease on the outside of that pusher. I'm guessing in an attempt to make that button function more smoothly, although that that's not the part of the pusher that actually touches the case, and silicone grease is going to serve absolute, just zero function there. It won't do a thing to make that pusher work better. Pulling out the crown and stem, and we have another flat gasket on that. Now, you're going to see me moving a movement around a little bit, and I noticed something at first, and I'm trying to make sure my eyes aren't deceiving me. And I just figured I'd leave this footage in here for a minute because although I'm not supposed to, that Andy didn't send me this watch to, work on it mechanically to rebuild the movement. We need to make sure the pushers are working and the reset works and just make sure the watch is functional. And I spot a problem. So if you take a look right here where the hammer and the hammer return spring are, you see how they're kind of lifted up. It almost looks, that hammer looks bent. I'll go ahead and throw an arrow up here. We have a few things. So that is the flyback lever post, and that is supposed to sit on the edge of the hammer, not underneath it. The back side of the hammer return spring should fit in that little groove on the underside of that post on the hammer itself, and it's sitting on top. Likewise, with the front side of the hammer spring, it should be sitting in that groove right there where that arrow is, not above the post. And all that is due to the flyback lever and the flyback lever pin being underneath the hammer. So this needs to be fixed before we can really do anything. This watch isn't going to reset regardless of what we do with the case. So what I'm going to do first is just try to get that spring set on the underside lip of that post on the hammer. Right there, we got it. And we'll go ahead and bring this back and put it on the outside of that post. Now what we need to do is get that hammer, that flyback lever and its post out from underneath the hammer. So we'll push this back. You saw a little piece of junk fly off of there. Now that spring's there. And if this were my watch, I was rebuilding the movement, I may tweak the shape of that spring a little bit, but we'll check functionality here in a minute. I want to check this reset and just see what it does first. So for that, I'm going to go ahead and put the movement ring back in just to kind of help keep everything still because we still have our dial and hands on this thing. And manually pressing in on that flyback lever, the reset actually feels pretty good. Surprisingly, but that's what a reset should look like. And thankfully, those pins, that flyback lever pin can break. I'm amazed actually that it wasn't broke. There is a little bit of spot of significant wear on the hammer where that strike point is. And, but it was functioning. I would address that further probably if I was doing a full movement service, but it is 100% workable. And man, look at that dial. And I'll tell you what, folks, that dial, I almost thought it was, an aftermarket. It's not. Super close inspection of the loom shows some age. Same with the hands on, they do show their age close up. That's a legit, amazing condition original dial. On this crystal, at first glance, the crystal looked pretty good. And it is, if you let the light reflect off of it and get a glare, we can really get an idea of what kind of scratches are in this crystal. Andy wants a new one, so we're going to do that anyway. So we need to take the bezel off the case. And what I'm looking for is the little notch where the bezel meets the case. There's a little gap. See that gap right there? That is the point where we insert our tool to wedge between there and pull that bezel off. So I'm using some plastic to hold it. Sometimes it can be a bit stubborn. I'm going to regrip here, and I'm just kind of wedging this tool in, not prying upwards or anything, just kind of pushing inwards and rotating it a little bit, and eventually it pops. Now we can pull our bezel off. Again, someone definitely cleaned this watch before they sold it. 100%. We can pop our gasket out now, or our crystal out. It's really just being held in by the crystal gasket at this point, because the bezel is what retains those. Now the rest of the case disassembly. This crystal gasket is a Viton material gasket. If you've watched other videos, we've talked about that previously. But that gasket, they're not very cost effective to make, and they stopped making them way back. But those gaskets is generally, as long as they're not physically damaged, they don't really harden, or they're very temperature resistant, chemical resistant. So we got that metal ring that holds down our rotating bezel. There is a tension spring right here, and that spring goes between that metal ring and the rotating bezel and keeps that bezel pressed downwards. And now we can pull our bezel out. And you'll see teeth on the outside of that bezel and on the underside of the bezel. And that's because that part's used in a few different models. Somebody put silicone grease all over the bottom side of this part, and it's not supposed to have grease on it. So I'm going to take some Rodico and get the bulk of it off. I'm going to clean this part manually, because you don't put this in a watch cleaning machine. Don't put it in ultrasonic. And ultrasonic will it'll eat away almost all of the paint on your markers for that rotating bezel. So it'll just come out black, and all those white markings will be gone. So we're just going to clean this up by hand, however long it takes. Next step in the cleaning process is taking pegwood and just breaking loose all of the big heavy stuff and just getting Rodico out there. Same process with this little spacer that holds down that tension spring on the bezel, and the top side of that ring has a groove in it that crystal gasket will fit in place. But this is the process for just using pegwood, and this will get all the big clumps of dirt off there. It's also really effective on surface rust. You can graduate to using like a fiberglass brush if needed. And again, this case is not really dirty at all, but we're just making sure that this is good to go. However, there was a bunch of dried up and very gummy silicone grease inside those pusher slots in the case. And that was kind of a nightmare to get out. But we just be very thorough and pegwood this thing until we're happy with it. Looking pretty good. Using some Rodico to kind of get in the nooks and crannies. Next up is the pushers and the crown. So here's where things get interesting. And here's why that one pusher was so stuck. What I'm using is a very high-tech gasket removal tool. And it's called a pair of fingernail clippers. On worn gaskets that are very rock hard, those things just flake apart and they almost disintegrate and they pull off real easy. What you're going to find here, these gaskets are actually supple. So what this means is these are not the correct gaskets that have worn down and become flat, because the correct gaskets on the chronograph pushers are supposed to be D-shaped. These are actually good condition gaskets, but the wrong gasket. Since these are flat-sided gaskets, the correct gaskets have a D-shaped profile on the outer ring. These have a flat profile. So the surface area that's touching the inside wall of that crown tube is way bigger with these gaskets, and that's causing it to have a whole lot of issues moving. These are the wrong gaskets for this watch. And you can see there, it's still pretty supple. It did break eventually. On this Viton gasket for the crystal, we can reuse this. We just have to clean it. And if you look at the underside of this gasket, you'll see that little secondary step. That little profile is what fits inside that spacer ring that holds down the tension ring for the rotating bezel. We pulled out our spring bars. The top two are for our end links, and you see those are two different spring bars, and one of them is pretty significantly bent. The other one is for our clasp. We're going to go ahead and replace all those. So getting ready for everything to be cleaned. I have these little mesh wire and brass baskets. I'm going to load everything up and dunk them in here. And what this is hot water with a mixture of Simple Green and like a Dawn dish detergent. And oh my gosh, can you believe that? I actually missed the basket. Patrick Stewart, Captain Picard, is not proud. So we get that in. Now we can move it over to our ultrasonic and see what song it wants to play for us today. All right. So while those parts are in the ultrasonic machine being cleaned, we're going to turn our attention to the case back gasket. So what I have here is a little jar of 99% IPA, medical grade IPA, and that footage is actually kind of cut short a little bit. There's a long gap in there. I swirl that around in there for quite a bit, making sure that gasket is clean. And again, that's the beauty of this Viton material. That IPA will not dissolve, degrade, or dry out any part of that gasket. So now we have our manually cleaned and now grease free rotating inner bezel and our tension spring. And now we can put this ring above it. And again, that just presses down on that tension spring and thus the bezel to keep it downwards. I'll show you a view of it later on why it's important to always make sure there's downward pressure on that bezel. And now we need to get our crystal gasket back into place. So this crystal gasket does not receive any silicone grease. There is some, some literature out there that says, some people do it, but all the instruction I've ever received or read said you don't need to, and I never have, and these Viton gaskets don't need it. But as you saw there, just making sure that it's in that groove on that spacer ring all the way around. Once that's in, we have a nice, fresh replacement crystal. We're going to go ahead and get that popped in there. And I really like these crystals, and I actually had someone reach out to me just the other day who has crystals made for these watches and asked if I'd like to give him a try. So he's really cool of him to send me one, and I'm going to give him a try. And if I like them, I'll kind of let you know whose crystals they are. So I'm excited to see those. I put our bezel back on, trying to center up the 60 mark, the top part of that bezel with the dead center of the case. It looks a little off because the internal rotating bezel's not aligned right now, but I'll just a little foreshadowing. I didn't have to adjust that when I nailed it first try. See the teeth on the bottom side of that rotating bezel? When it's pushed downwards fully, that's where it's going to engage with that pinion on the stem when it's pushed in. So that makes sure that those are all engaged. So now we have our case put back together. We're going to marry it back up with our movement. We can flip it over. Now I have our gasket set. What you see there is a new case back gasket. Of the smaller O-rings, the larger of the three is for the crown, and the smallest size are going to be for our two chronograph pushers. So we'll go ahead and get this on there. And I'll tell you, there was a lot of junk on that stem. So there are probably easier ways. There's a tool to make this install a little bit smoother, but I like to hold one edge of it with my finger and then just use my tweezers to wrap that around. And the silicone grease applied is most of it's lost during, me putting it on, but it makes kind of stretching that spring or that gasket a lot easier. These are the pusher gaskets, and see that profile on the edge where it kind of comes to a point? Those are called D-shaped gaskets. A little trick I came up with. I'm sure I'm not the only one, but I kind of put the gasket on the ground and kind of rotate that pusher on it. That gets over that initial hurdle of getting it on those on those pushers. Folks who've done it know sometimes those can be kind of a pain, but there are some people that make tools to do it. But I find this method only takes 10 seconds or so, and it's pretty effective. We'll get that gasket on there, and make sure, it didn't invert on us or anything, which they really don't ever do. But there we go. That's what the correct gasket on those looks like. We'll do that to both, and then we have new springs. Although the old ones were not in bad shape, we got brand new springs. And so what I'm doing is applying just a very thin coat of silicone grease inside these tubes. And on these particular watches, on these Seikos, and it's a good practice, I think, to do on basically anything, but you'll notice a difference if you push those in dry. You'll notice immediately that those pushers or your crown can be and especially the crown, can be very difficult to manipulate and push in if you don't have proper silicone grease. And it's not a bunch, just a little film in those tubes. We got this crown tube all cleaned up. And again, that was kind of a nightmare. Even after ultrasonic, I went through and did clean up a few things by hand, but it's looking bright and shiny and perfect. And I don't know what the grease situation inside this watch is, but I'm going to just put a very light film of grease on this. And if you watch that gasket as we push it in, it is those are a tight squeeze inside that crown tube. So making sure that we've got a little thin layer of silicone grease inside that tube, that thing pops in and now feels perfect. But it can be very tough, and especially a day or two after, you'll notice that it can be very tough to push in. You may need to, I learned that way and have to go in there and put some grease in that tube. I decided to take a look at the time grapher because he didn't send this to me to do anything mechanically, but I wanted to take a look. And so I put a full wind in the mainspring manually by turning the ratchet wheel screw. And I want to flip this over. So I'm just temporarily putting the case back on. I know we don't have the rotor in yet or anything, but just turning that on so I can safely flip this watch. And you can see the amplitude's severely low, rate is severely high. So, if you wear it for a day or two, it looked good. But if you wear this watch for a week straight, you're going to be a few minutes fast. Right here, the only thing I did, I went and put it on the demagnetizer for 2 seconds. And these are the immediate results right after the demagnetizer. And you can see amplitude's up. Our rate, we went from 60 and 70 seconds to 15 to 20 seconds, 25 seconds. So now, generally I use a much smaller plastic tool to adjust this. I'm adjusting the beat error right now. And again, usually I use a much smaller tool, but apparently I misplaced it. So I'm using the backside of my utility pick. That was way too much. Moving that regulator right there towards the hairspring stud effectively lengthens the hairspring and slows the watch down. Pushing it away speeds it back up. That was the initial adjustment. I need to speed it up just a tiny bit. So I'm just using just the lightest touch on the edge of a screwdriver and just the tiniest touch. And we'll just see what this does. And again, this isn't serviced. Looking in the balance jewels, I didn't really see much of an oil ring in the upper balance jewel. There's a tiny one in there. There's some oil in there, but I think this watch could benefit from a service. Timekeeping is going to be significantly better. He can wear this watch every day. A little noise will up the gain on the time grapher, but this amplitude's low, especially for a watch having been recently worked on, clearly as it was. But it's not the end of the world. This thing will run continuously. From the outside, if you don't own a time grapher, you'd never know your amplitude was low. It's going to keep good time. But I think in a couple of years, this watch could do for a service. But since we're not doing that, we're just doing the case right now. I just want it to run as good as it can. And, we could have a whole lot worse than that. That's not bad at all. Totally wearable. Sometimes we get too caught up on amplitude, but, 180's a little low for these movements, but well within the range of these things running reliably, it'll run. We have a fresh and correct caseback gasket. We'll go ahead and get that put on. Rodico makes a very, very easy to use handle to turn those things. And now we'll put this in the caseback press and tighten this down properly. And again, I just like to use some plastic just to make sure I don't create any scratches during this operation. And now I want to check the reset and just the chronograph function. So what I'm doing is I'm just going to let this thing run for quite a bit. I actually step out of the room and we'll speed the footage up here. And I think it runs 10 or 11 minutes or something like that. So we got a few seconds left here. But I wanted to see what this reset looked like, because this is really our first opportunity to see what it is. And so we got the correct two-piece chronoseconds hand on this thing. So we'll stop the chronograph and I push the pusher in and watch how weird this looks. See how it had that little jump? That was my fault, not the watch, because I barely pushed that button in. And I noticed it and I said, you know what? No, I need to do this one more time. Because unlike, the Swiss chronographs where the reset, no matter how hard you press the button, it just releases and the hammer hits the wheels via the tension of a spring. On this movement, the hammer hits the wheels at the force you use when you push the button. So a super light reset, isn't going to really cut it sometimes. Just a regular normal push, and that thing is dead on. And you'll see how dead on that thing is, comparing it to the position of the bezel. I did not have to readjust the position of that bezel. I nailed that in one shot. So again, kind of just taking a look and doing a quick function test just to make sure that everything's working properly. A 50% push changes the date, and a push in all the way adjusts the day, and that's working perfectly. My mind is in the mechanical mode, and I'm noticing the tension on the cannon pinion on this watch feels excellent. Date change is right where it needs to be. That's looking good. The bezel turns smoothly, and there's no silicone grease inside of it. That's exactly what we want. And again, one more reset. Perfect. Just like the case, you notice that we put our bracelet in the cleaning solution as well, and that came out really, really nice. So we got fresh spring bars in there. And now I'm just pressing this little pin in, and I made sure to remember which position this was on the clasp, so that when Andy gets his watch back, it's adjusted in the exact same position it was when he sent it to me. Because I'd imagine that would be kind of frustrating having to resize your watch, when you get it back from your watchmaker. So I tried to remember, and it wasn't hard to remember. He was on the deepest inward pin. So we got that in with a fresh spring bar in there as well. And that thing snaps shut quite nicely, quite affirmatively. And it's nice to see the correct original bracelet on this watch too. Again, Andy's example of this watch is probably cleaner than mine in the video I recently had with this same watch. So, Andy, here's your watch, and I really hope you enjoyed it. Quick shout out, thank you to the patrons of this channel. I couldn't do it without you. A special shout out to our two newest members, Frank and Jim. Appreciate you both for joining. Really means a lot. Thank you so, so much. And folks, if you want to see anything about the Patreon page, you can take a look at the description of the video. There's a link. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. 27 minutes is pretty short for this channel, but Andy's watch gave me the opportunity to do something that I haven't done before, and that's do a hyper detailed case servicing video. Thank you one last time, Andy, for trusting me with your watch. And on a side note, ladies and gentlemen, I hope the audio wasn't terrible. If you would believe it, about 6.5 hours ago, 7 hours ago, I was in a dental office chair for 90 minutes, and my mouth had been numb for several hours since, and I just started doing this voice work as soon as the numbness started to wear off. So hopefully the voiceover wasn't terrible. But again, folks, thank you one last time. I know it sounds redundant, but until the next one, take care of yourselves and each other, and we'll see you soon. Bye.